So, yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. Currently, there's about 40,000 people in the United States who are in immigration detention centers. I think over 90% of them are run by for-profit companies. Um, in the very early months of the Biden administration, they made a big deal about trying to end for-profit prisons. They didn't say anything about for-profit immigration detention centers, and I think that's a really interesting sort of moral carve out as I see it, that they're willing to hear the criticism and say, like, we don't want to lock up our own residents in for-profit detention or for-profit prisons, but they're willing to do so in um, for immigrants. And recently, the Biden administration is now enacting a very different sort of policy than the tune that they came in singing, which is that they're going to restore asylum and all this. Recently, they have been celebrating the fact that they are working closely with for-profit immigration detention contractors. And they, I'm on all of their email sort of newsletters, and I get them saying, like, we have to work with these stakeholders and we have to make sure that have this good relationship with these organizations like Geo Group or Core Civic, that their whole profit strategy is to give the fewest possible services that they can and get and charge the government as much as they can, and that is how they make their profit.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 204. I'm talking to John Washington. He's author of The Case for Open Borders. Yeah, he writes with The Intercept. And we're going to talk about immigration. John also lives in Tucson, so he's not that far from the American border. How are you, John?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, thanks for having me on. Glad to chat with you.
Okay, John, first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got where you are today, what got you interested in this issue?
Sure. So you mentioned The Intercept. I used to write for them a lot. I currently am a staff writer at Arizona Luminaria. We're a new nonprofit media outlet here.
And Arizona what?
Luminaria.
Okay.
So just a couple years old. I also write for a number of other magazines and things, and have been focusing on the border, not exclusively, for over a decade. A lot of my interest comes from some of my family's own experience. So I grew up listening to stories about migration. My mother was a migrant. She came from Romania, fleeing totalitarian regime there, and just always heard stories about her departure, the difficulties of her departure, escape. Lots of cousins and family members would just talk about things like hiding in train compartments or swimming across rivers to try to get across a border. And as a kid, I kind of thought it was something from some previous era or some faraway place. And when I started coming to age politically, I realized that this stuff is going on in some sense in an even more difficult way right now at our country's borders. And we're just kind of fascinated by how I didn't even really know about it or didn't really hear about it growing up or hear about much about it. And then all of a sudden it sort of exploded. And it's like politically one of the things that is always returned to and is just used as such a political football or cudgel. And there's so much misinformation. So when I first started getting down here and reporting in Southern California, Southern Arizona, what you see with your own eyes just doesn't match up with the way that the border, the way that immigration policy, the way that immigration trends are talked about at all. And it's just like, wow, we need to shine some light and bring some truth to this conversation. So that's, what's sort of driven me to write a couple books about it and do translation and now report on it.
Yeah, this is what I always find why I'm on this topic. And people ask me why I generally do favor open borders. And I just say, well, I want open borders so that I can leave. And, you're talking about your mother's story, but wasn't that really the challenge? The hardest part was not getting into a country, but the hardest part was getting out of Romania.
That's right. struggled to secure exit visas, which is not
Yeah.
something that people in the United States think too hard about right now. It's a long story. I won't go into all the details, but they were able to get to the United States. But the fight, and it was years long, was to get permission to leave Romania. This is something that we don't talk that much about now. So the right of egress is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone
Yeah.
has a right to leave their own country. But I have been witnessing in recent weeks that I don't think Mexico and the United States is properly upholding that right. So currently, people who are trying to access the United States to ask for asylum, which is their right under international law, under Mexican law, under US law, are being restricted from actually approaching the ports of entry. And there's some people are pointing this out, and there's some legal sort of maneuvering starting to happen. But I really think that they're violating that basic fundamental human right.
Yeah, you know what's kind of sad though? I do think back in the 80s, Americans were because of what they heard about the evil empire and the Warsaw Pact. I would say Americans were somewhat sympathetic to anybody who would come from a country like Romania or the old Soviet Union. But nowadays, there's really I don't see if there's any kind of sympathy. I am curious though. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it was like for your mom to get out of Romania, just to
Yeah, sure. A quick note about that comment that you made, though. I mean, you're exactly right. The disparities in the way that we welcome or process people who are seeking asylum are glaring, and they've been so for a long time. So we traditionally, like, if you go back to the 1980s, you'll see that people who are fleeing what were seen as like leftist regimes like Nicaragua were given much, much higher grant rates than people who were fleeing so-called friendly countries, or for countries that were, open for business to the United States, like El Salvador and Guatemala. And those people had asylum grant rates sometimes below a single percent. And then we see the same sort of dynamic play out in different parts of the world. If folks in the 80s and 90s were fleeing these communist regimes, they had, reasonable grant rates. And if they were fleeing elsewhere, friendly countries, they were often denied and sent back. So the trouble was for the exit visa for my mother and how she got out. So through a sort of a bizarre series of events, my grandmother was actually a U.S. citizen. She was born in the United States. Her parents were part of an earlier wave of Eastern European migration in the early 20th century. And she was born in the United States and then moved back to Romania before she turned 1. And she didn't even know that she was a U.S. citizen. She didn't even know that she was born in the U.S. She had no knowledge of English or anything like that. She grew up in a tiny village in central Romania, in Transylvania. But then when things escalated politically between, like you said, like the Warsaw Pact countries and the West, that was when it came out that they had family who were U.S. citizens, and they were, discriminated against because of that. And that was one of the reasons that they weren't granted the exit visa, because they thought that they would leave to go to the United States, which is what they wanted to do, in fact. And it was a years-long process. At first, they gave the visas only to my grandfather and mother and uncle, and my grandmother was going to stay behind, but they didn't want to do that. Family separation, basically. So they kept on fighting, and a whole long slog, dangerous process, honestly. And they finally were able to get out. I mean, my family also suffered persecution because of anti-communism in Romania, and it was really scary for a lot of people. And people were killed, people were arrested, and it was bad.
Killed for trying to get on the border. I know. Also in Transylvania, there's that small little section of Hungarian-speaking Romanians. Right. I don't know if they were part of that either, but that's also had some discrimination, unfortunately.
Yep, a lot of Hungarian Jews, and they were rounded up and also sent to some of the concentration camps that aren't as commonly recognized, but a lot of that happened in Romania as well.
Well, and unfortunately, the borders don't always correspond to where the people who speak the language are.
It's one of the central tenets, of I think the the irony of bordering is that actually the borders follow no real tradition,
Yeah.
in some exceptions to that, but they don't match populations, they don't match ethnicity, they don't even follow geographic like lines, like either mountain ranges or rivers and things. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. So yeah, borders are arbitrarily drawn.
Yeah. So yeah, that's very, very interesting. Romania. I mean, thinking about, and with the Olympics going on, I can think of two famous Romanian defectors, Bela Karolyi and Nadia Comaneci,
Yep.
who before those people, Americans didn't care about gymnastics. So but anyway, so and this is one thing you study. What do you think right now is the biggest myth that you hear about immigration?
Geez, there's so many. It's almost hard to pick one out. I think probably one that I think is important to talk about is the idea that countries will be overwhelmed, like Western countries will be overwhelmed by migrants. If there's any moment in history which you could say that, let's say, the United States is being or has been overwhelmed, it was a couple hundred years ago when the first colonialists came in and started indiscriminately slaughtering people who were living here. That's not what's happening today. Calling this an invasion is just not accurate by its own terms. There's a very big difference between people coming and migrating, people coming and invading. And migrants assimilate into the society that they're entering into, and they follow the laws. They don't try to take power from the powers that be. And invaders, that's exactly what they do, and that's exactly what
yes.
Is. So also the numbers of migrants too, while they are high, and though they've dropped significantly over the past 7 months, I mean, we haven't seen numbers this low in about 4.5 years. But even at the height of the most recent spike in migration last December, it was about the same as it was in the year 2000. And it's a little bit hard to measure because we don't know how many people slipped through undetected. So it could have been even higher in the year 2000. And as a percentage of the population, the number of people who are foreign-born in the United States has held steady. It's wavered somewhat by a point or two, but has really held steady for over 100 years at this point. So it is a lot of migration if you just look at the sheer number, but if you look at percentage of population, and if you look at the ability to assimilate, and in fact, the need for migrants in the United States and in many Western countries, you'll see that migration is not a threat, but is actually a boon to these societies and these communities that they're residing in now.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. If they're undocumented, nobody's documenting them. They're not reported. It's kind of like, when you read these statistics about unreported rapes. I mean, well, how do you know how many unreported rapes there are if they were never reported? It's I think that's a valid argument. It's and I don't know, overwhelming. Maybe the 1840s with the Irish potato famine, but
right. That's one of the things I specifically looked at. I was doing some reporting on the situation in New York City when Mayor Adams and even Kathy Hochul, the governor, were just saying the most outlandish things about migrants being an existential threat to New York City. So it's something that Mayor Adams said. And the per capita, the number of migrants who, mostly from Venezuela, who landed in New York City in the past 3+ years is still below 200,000. And that is nothing in comparison to earlier waves of migrants. You mentioned the Germans, or you mentioned the Irish, rather, the Irish, and then followed by the Germans in the 1840s to 60s, and then Italian and other, Eastern Southern Europeans in the early 20th century. And just like New York, that's why New York is such an amazing place. I mean, whatever, it's not for everybody, but it's a thriving, like one of the major cities in the world. And it's because of that migration, not in spite of it.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland has possibly sent America more immigrants per capita than almost any country, I think, just because it's not that big a country. And then you had this huge historical event. You had starving people. And I suppose, as you said, in most cases, they probably either ended up in New York or Boston back then.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
there's always been a substantial Irish population there, but that was also, the first time I think we had another active discrimination movement against people. Well, at least against other white people. The cliche, no Irish need apply.
Yeah.
It's but we've always had, and there's and it's one of the things I look at is it seems like nothing good comes out of these anti-immigration movements.
So yeah, the other, you asked what the biggest myth is, and the other one that was, I was sort of wavering which one to start with, basically, is the effectiveness of anti-immigration policies or border walls. They just don't work. You look at a number of the most draconian policies that have been put in place just in recent memory in the United States. Family separation. I mean, that was meant to deter people from coming. And this is something that I reported a lot on in my first book, The Dispossessed, and also just for magazines back in 2018, 2019. And what we saw in the months immediately after they first implemented this policy is more families were coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and trying to cross. And that was not, or that was because they needed to. That was because they were in danger where they were, and they were desperately seeking some form of safety. Title 42, which is one of the policies that the Trump administration put in place to automatically deny everyone who was looking for asylum and immediately push them back into Mexico. More people, this was never in the history of modern immigration politics did border officials have more authority to immediately expel people ever. And more people started coming because, again, they needed to. Right now, I said that numbers have dropped, and a recent policy put in place by the Biden administration is denying asylum to almost everyone who comes. This is sort of like the wait and see period. And also Mexico is really doing a major crackdown on their side, and numbers have dropped. But anyone who has been following this, anyone who studies this closely, is just bracing themselves for the numbers to start creeping back up. And maybe they'll duck it until the election, maybe not. But it's basically inevitable. And the reason why is, we have to start talking about root causes, which it is worth remembering the border wall immigration policies do not address. So if you want to stop people from coming, just trying to block them, seal them off, isn't effective because people get around walls, and it doesn't address the underlying cause why they're moving in the first place. So if you really want to stop migration, think about addressing why people are leaving. And here, let me give you one stat and to show you how we have it backwards. So there's a recent 5-year period, I think it was leading up to 2022, where the United States spent 11 times more on border enforcement than on climate change mitigation. And climate change and climate crises are one of the now leading causes why people are leaving their homes and leaving their home countries and trying to move elsewhere. So if your end goal is to stop people from coming to the United States, putting up a wall isn't the way to do it. I'm not trying to give the xenophobes strategy points, but if you really want to stop people, start looking at why they're leaving. And that's not something we're really doing.
If I put up a sign outside my house that says free food, I'm going to have a lot of people knocking on my door, and I'm really, that really does constitute an invitation. I might not be explicitly saying come on inside my house, but it certainly is going to make people want to come in if it says free food inside. I mean, we have all these, so it's a mixed message. You put up this wall saying, "Oh, we don't want you coming here," but then we have all these giveaways, which at least make it easier for them when they do get here. And I mean, I don't think that was the case necessarily in the past, but seems to be, at least for some, the objection. I don't want to pay taxes for these people to come here.
Yeah. So
if they're going to come here, make them pay their own way and make them pay for everything once they get here.
Yeah. They largely do. I think I take your point, but I think the idea of giveaways is overblown in terms of migration. So people who are able to access asylum or refugee status and come here, They may have some minor assistance in the early weeks or maybe extending past that, but they are not enrolled in welfare. They are not given gift cards. They're not given free flights. This is something that has been a talking point, especially on the hard right, for the past couple of years under the Biden administration. None of that is actually happening. There are some extreme exceptions where people are absolutely stuck. Maybe someone will get some
Yeah.
assistance by a local organization to get a flight, but that's largely that is not happening. And in fact, they cannot access Social Security, they cannot access welfare benefits, any means tested welfare benefits, um, until they become legal permanent residents and pay in for at least 5 years. And that process takes a long time, like probably over a decade.
Yeah.
They will not be able to access any of that giveaways for a long time. So they will be paying into the pot. They will be paying local taxes. They'll be paying potentially property taxes. And if they become legal permanent residents, they can be paying more taxes as well. But they're not going to be reaping any of the benefits from those for a long time. So they pay in much more than they take out. A couple of studies have shown that in some cases, largely even first generation immigrants are paying in more than they're reaping in benefits. But in some cases, it's more like even. In some, it goes over to the red. But in second and third generation, basically all cases, those generations of recent migrants put way more into the common pot than they're able to receive.
Yeah. One thing I have heard though, what about what I would call indirect payments? For example, I've heard that a big supporter of immigrants is Catholic Charities. Now, Catholic Charities is not a government organization, but apparently they do take a lot of government money. So it's maybe not paid directly from the government, but through some of these third parties.
Yeah, they do, and like I said, like there is some sort of a welcome period. It's often very short. There's some cases where it extends beyond that, but I've done a lot of reporting at some of these locations here that Catholic Charities has been involved in, and what that welcome looks like and what the money is spent on are there is a facility that is. Will welcome between a couple dozen to a couple hundred in some cases people a day. They'll give them a meal, maybe a change of clothes. They'll let them use a phone. They'll let them charge their own phones. Sometimes there's very basic medical care, but this is stuff like if they
Yeah.
have a cold, if they have blisters and things like that. And then they might give them a ride to the airport, but they're not paying for those
Yeah.
flights. And the welcome doesn't really extend much more than that day or a few days beyond that. It adds up when there's a few 100,000 people coming in. But again, like this isn't like we're paying for their apartments. This isn't like we're paying for car payments or giving them gift cards and things like that. There are charities that sometimes do that. Those charities sometimes receive some public funding, but that public funding, like those tax dollars, are really not streaming straight to immigrants. And again, it is actually in our benefit, and for two reasons why it's in the benefit of native residents of the United States, and other countries are doing the same thing. One is that if we left them to their own devices right away, it would actually lead to probably more emergency room visits, more homelessness. They wouldn't be able to access just basic things to get by those first days and weeks, and they would resort to, being what would probably be termed as a blight or seen as a blight on local communities. So it's actually in these local communities' benefit to help them land on their feet a little bit and find some place to settle. And second, going back to the earlier point, we need migrants right now. There's a lot of sectors of the economy that there are major job shortages. We need the tax dollars. We need the people to come in, and it is overall a net benefit for the national economy as well as more local economies to actually help these people a little bit up front, and we're going to be reaping the benefits down the road. Now, I say that I don't like to think about these people as like cash chips. I don't think we should be welcoming them in because it's good for our economy. That is a secondary benefit. I think we should be welcoming because it's the right and human thing to do. But it's also worth pointing out, I think it's important to address these counter arguments that actually it is in your financial interest as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes you have cases too. I mean, I knew a lady from Portugal who I think came here, and she was a nurse in Portugal, but for some reason her nursing qualifications didn't work here. So you have situations like that. I don't know what the whole reasoning was for that, but it was kind of unfortunate. It's like, I know we have a nursing shortage here. Why can't she go get a job go get a nursing job here? And I think she wanted to do that. And obviously that's certainly not that's certainly higher paying job, than a lot of jobs that immigrants take when they get here. But
yeah, nursing, teachers, construction workers, down at the border right here, there's a lot of cattle ranching, and the people who are actually out in the fields wrangling the
yeah,
heads of cattle, they are not Anglos. They are not white people, really. They are recent arrivals from Latin America, and without more immigrants to take those jobs and do those jobs, a lot of these industries just would not function.
and some of these jobs don't necessarily involve a lot of talking, and they have the transferable skills. Maybe
Yeah.
and maybe also, I don't know, auto mechanics as well, or it's
Yeah.
certainly construction is one of those
Yeah.
things, and it's you see
You
that
know,
happening.
I know you come from a libertarian background, or like that's your
Yeah,
the politics you write about or discuss on the show, and to me this is such a clear case. I'm not libertarian. I am sympathetic to some of the principles that y'all espouse, but one of the basic things that I think a lot of people can agree with, and I do, is like you have two parties who are willing and wanting to engage each other in a contract. I want to work. I want a worker. Who's going to step in and break that up? And that is exactly the case with a lot of the people who are doing lettuce farming, doing tomato farming, doing cattle ranching, doing construction, especially down in the Southwest. I know in a lot of other places as well, but you meet that a lot. It's like the employers want this. It's like, why is the government getting my way and saying I can't hire this guy who I know is a hard worker, I know can do the job, and I need him to do it? And then all of a sudden the government steps in and said, you need to go through this E-Verify system. You need to we might have to pick up this guy, rip him out of his family home, and send him 1,000 miles away, and he's probably going to get back anyway. And then he's going to have to work under the radar. It's like, why does the government have to step in and mess with that system?
yeah, and I've seen it on the other end too. My former employer was opening up a small office in I think it was in Switzerland, but they had to go through all this, and they wanted to send one person over there for 2 years to help get the office started, but they had to go through all this red tape and prove that they couldn't find a qualified person there before they sent him over. It's
Yeah.
and you have all this. Yeah, it does the right to hire who you want to hire, although and in some cases the fact that immigrants are illegal actually makes them less able to compete in the market.
Right.
Uh, they're less able to protest. Not to mention, I do think if they're illegal, they're also much more likely to be targeted for things that might be considered abusive. They're not going to.
That's true. But it's not just people who actually are
Yeah,
undocumented. It's people who are even guest workers. I mean, guest workers are exploited as well. They come in, and the contracts that they have to sign is that they're not able to renegotiate their contract. They're not able to seek other employers, and the employers then abuse them because of that. They know that if they don't do exactly what I tell them to, I can just give them the boot. They have no leverage at all to think like, okay, well, this employer is treating me like crap. I'm going to go work at the farm next door. And so it invites abuse even through authorized work programs as well.
yeah. I've even heard some unfortunate stories of South Korean employers being really abusive toward North Koreans, which is probably as hard a place to get out of as anywhere. But
Yeah.
uh, yeah, because that's also a very militarized border. But
And yet they do. And like that is like install a DMZ. You can like line a riverbed with landmines. You can put triple fencing, razor wire, like armed guards, and still people get out. They're like North Koreans. It's a lot harder, but they
yeah,
can't get out. And sometimes they die trying, but they're not completely locked in. Even them. The Berlin Wall, like that, was not impermeable. Walls are not impervious.
Yep. Well, the other thing too, even if they hear rumors, apparently in North Korea, if you're even thinking about leaving, they might just come home, show up, and kill you for it. I mean, it's that bad. It's so if you are thinking about leaving North Korea, you really can't tell anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things, And yeah, John, it also seems like there's almost becoming these various industries around immigration or around because we make immigration so difficult here. Sometimes I know people who have been victimized by, these scammy lawyers who say, "Oh, I'll help you get your just give me $2,000 and I'll help you process your paperwork."
Yeah.
And then they don't really do anything for them at all and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, it didn't work out," but they've got the money and.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a pretty common scenario, unfortunately. Unlike people who are accused of crimes, of felonies in the United States, immigrants who show up to court, who have to show up at court to fight their case, are not guaranteed the right to counsel. And yet they need it because we have made immigration law so incredibly difficult to understand. I mean, it is so arcane and labyrinthine. It is very, very difficult. It's like second only to probably tax law is how complicated it is. And yet, you think about it, like, why is that the case? Like, why does it need to be so complicated? I think it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I think people make it more complicated than it is because, in fact, it's quite simple. Someone moves because they have to or because they want to, and like if they can find a place to land and find like employer and a community, then let them do it. But yet we've created this bizarre and very complicated like edifice trying to keep them out or trying to like weed the people who are trying to get in. And if you don't have an attorney right now and you want to either gain access through asylum or through some other means, it's nearly impossible. And then that's when people are subject to these predatory, sort of snaky attorneys who will come in and or like the different they will come in and just like try to squeeze them for a couple $1,000 and then leave them out to dry. It's a really sad situation.
Yes, and I believe there's also seems to be now this industry with private prisons and stuff, and now you have private detention centers because most of the other country, I used to work with a guy who overstayed his visa in Argentina,
Mhm.
and he was arrested, and the next day he was on an airplane. It said, "You overstayed your visa. You're not here. Get out of here. Go home." So that was it. They didn't,
Yeah,
nowadays there's this business of detaining immigrants as
yeah.
opposed to just sending them home. So you now have another case where there's more people profiteering from just, the incarceration of illegal immigrants, which
Yep.
seems.
So yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. Currently, there's about 40,000 people in the United States who are in immigration detention centers. I think over 90% of them are run by for-profit companies. Um, in the very early months of the Biden administration, they made a big deal about trying to end for-profit prisons. They didn't say anything about for-profit immigration detention centers, and I think that's a really interesting sort of moral carve out as I see it, that they're willing to hear the criticism and say like we don't want to lock up our own residents in for-profit detention or for-profit prisons, but they're willing to do so in for immigrants. And recently, the Biden administration has is now enacting a very different sort of policy than the tune that they came in singing, which is that they're going to restore asylum and all this. Recently, they have been celebrating the fact that they are working closely with for-profit immigration detention contractors. And they, I'm on all of their email sort of newsletters, and I get them saying like, we have to work with these stakeholders, and we have to make sure that have this good relationship with these organizations like Geo Group or Core Civic, that their whole profit strategy is to give the fewest possible services that they can and get and charge the government as much as they can, and that is how they make their profit. And inside these detention centers, they're often described as far worse than prisons. People wish they could go back to a prison if they've had experience in a prison after spending some time in immigration detention. They are offered almost zero rec time. The food is disgusting, and like not enough calories are given, and they're mistreated by the guards. They're sometimes subjected to solitary confinement. They're sometimes force fed if they protest and want to go on hunger strike. I mean, the conditions are absolutely abysmal, and they're making money by doing this. It is shocking to me that we are not all shocked by this fact. And we're not up in arms saying like, this is not okay. This is not how we want to run society. This is even if you are going to say, look, all right, I'm not for open borders. I think that there should be some more regulations about how people can come. Okay, I disagree, but I see your point. But we should not torture people for trying to find safety. We should not torture people for trying to find a job. Like I don't think anyone should agree with that this is okay, and yet this is the state of the current status quo.
Yeah, it makes me ask myself, how would you, even if you didn't know somebody, if you show up at dinner sometime and somebody walks up to you and just say, "Hi, I'm, I got all this experience. I'm looking for a job." I mean, are you gonna, the person's not asking for money. They're just saying, "Hey, I want a chance to do something." I mean, that's one thing in my life. Even if I didn't know somebody, if somebody came up and asked me and said, "I'm looking for a job," I would certainly, I might be able to help you out here, or something like that. It's so, I don't know what motivates this. It's rather crazy. I think the biggest problem is, this zero sum thinking.
Right.
There's only so much food. There's only so much housing. There's only so much. And I don't think I don't think that's the case. I mean, I mean, I don't really want to see more people living in Austin, for example, but it's, but America could certainly survive if we had 500 million or 600 million people living here as opposed to the 330 million that we have.
Yeah.
It's and of course, I don't know what the roads would be like, but geez, it's
yeah, I agree. I know Austin very little, but I agree. Like, Austin, there's too many people in some places. It's just like, or the city isn't organized well enough to have that many people. Like, grown too quickly for its own good. But here's the thing: is like I obviously am a proponent of open borders, but I'm also a proponent of the corollary: is the right to stay, the right to remain at home.
Yeah,
I think that you can actually do both. It is not a zero-sum game, like you say. Like, actually, immigrants are good for the economy, as we said. Actually, immigrants filling jobs creates more jobs. Like, the labor economy is certainly not zero-sum, and all economists know this. And it's a shame that they're not like putting that myth to bed right away. But again, like we could welcome more people, but also immigration in some regards self-regulates. People go where there's opportunity and where there's welcome. And if a place gets too crowded or there's not jobs there, they'll go somewhere where there are jobs. And like, that just makes sense. The problem right now is that a lot of the 7 parts of the globe are being rendered effectively uninhabitable because of climate change or because of political turmoil. And the United States doesn't have a good record on either of those fronts. And we could do a lot better. We could stop messing around and trying to destroy economies. We could stop going to and launching foreign wars that destabilize entire regions. And if we stop that, if we try to address the past and recent harms we've committed, maybe not so many people would need to leave.
It's certainly a possibility. I've always thought of that. I mean, how many times has the U.S. stuck its nose into Haiti's business, or even just the war on drugs with Mexico? There are a lot of factors here. I mean, some cases, some of these countries in the Middle East have been destabilized, and those people are not in the U.S., but they're moving to Europe because they want something that's a little more stable. It's there's definitely a lot of factors here. And, as far as Mexico is concerned too, though, we hear certainly plenty of stories about Americans going to Mexico, because I think it's right now it's actually more Americans are going to Mexico than Mexicans coming to America.
I don't think it's quite that. They're basically like for a couple years there was sort of a net zero migration pattern between Mexico and the United States in terms of Mexicans, and that was the new thing. But I think still more Mexicans are coming to the United States than Americans are going south. But yeah, I mean you're absolutely right. Mexico, Haiti, they're both incredible examples of the United States has invaded Haiti 11 times, I think, in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
They have installed puppet governments. They have backed and launched coups. The situation in Mexico is not quite as egregious, but nonetheless, I mean, if you really are concerned about the drug war or drugs flowing from Mexico to the United States, which is I'm concerned about, I think is absolutely cause for concern. Think about what's driving that issue. Think about the supply, or sorry, the demand, and how much that is driving the supply. Like, why are so many people resorting to drugs? I mean, what existentially is going on with much of Middle America, where so many people are unemployed or dealing with mental health problems or unaddressed medical issues and are resorting to self-medicating through opioids? I mean, like.
Yeah.
That is, I think, the actual underlying cause. And we have over a century of evidence showing that crackdowns against smuggling, especially smuggling narcotics, don't work. They never have. They probably never will. In fact, right now,
Yeah.
Before in 20 years ago, most of the drugs that were coming across from Mexico was marijuana. That was relatively easy to find and to stop. But a lot of it still got through. I mean, a ton of it still got through. But they'd be able to pick up big loads because people were wearing these giant backpacks. Then it went to heroin, and now it's fentanyl. You can pack literally millions of pills in a single car. And if one car gets missed, there's suddenly a million more fentanyl pills. And the people are using now AI to design like lab concocted like synthetic opioids, and those things are going to be able to be set up like in warehouses, and
Yeah.
you can throw packages over the border. You can fly them over. Just you're not going to stop it by trying to just stop it at the border. You have to stop what's driving the demand in the first place.
Yeah. And John, sometimes I think some of this is just motivated by scapegoating.
Yeah.
America does not want to look at its problems and accept responsibility for a lot, because 99% of America's problems have been created by Americans. I mean,
Yeah.
whether the culture of hopelessness or the economy, or it's like you want to find somebody that you can blame
Yeah.
for these issues, and said, okay, we'll somehow just get rid of the immigrants and then the trains will run on time. I mean, no, it's not going to happen that way. It's but you want to be able to blame somebody, and I don't think Americans just want to take responsibility. It's
Yeah. Yeah, it's another enduring myth. The idea of migrant crime, and it's a really vile one too. Migrant, or actually, violent crime is down since 2020. But you look at, and again, study after study after study, and you could find, I mean, dozens and dozens of them in individual states, individual communities, in the United States as a whole, in other communities in across the world, where migrants consistently commit far fewer crimes than native-born residents, and yet they're the ones who get scapegoated, and then the politicians use that scapegoating, use that sort of ginned up fear to try to score political points, and it's something that happens every election cycle. It's disgusting, really. It's really sad that we let this happen.
They find one or two bad stories, and then they just talk about it repeatedly, and that suddenly becomes evidence that there's a crisis.
And those stories are bad. Like I admit, I mean, it
Yeah.
happens, but harms are committed in any sort of group of people anywhere on the planet, and stuff will happen, and migrants will commit even heinous crimes. That's absolutely the case. But one is you're not going to stop it by trying to build a wall or hire a wall. That's just going to be a futile effort. And second is, how do you address it? And like really, like even in the case of someone, let's say, getting into getting arrested for a DUI or even a violent crime, like is deporting it really addressing the issue? Is deporting that person addressing the issue? Like how can you well, let's think about something like justice. Okay, so let's say if you believe in punishment, I guess that could be seen as one form of punishment. If you believe in trying to just achieve justice and try to address the victim and make sure that they are feel support or get some sort of redress, shipping someone to a different place, like how does that actually solve anything? In fact, it just pushes the problem elsewhere. And it's also not cost effective. It's very expensive to deport people. It's very expensive to detain people.
More and more, I have a serious problem with this thing of we need to make something illegal in order to prevent something else. That activity is not bad in itself, but we need to but if we because it's like making murder illegal hasn't stopped murder, but somehow if we make baseball bats illegal, that will stop people from hitting people on the head with baseball bats.
Right.
It's
there's a term, a slightly sort of technical one, but I think it's actually useful. It's called iatrogenic crime. So iatrogenesis, it comes from a medical idea where the intervention is actually more harmful than the original ailment. And I think that's the case with migration. So migration, unauthorized migration, it has been deemed illegal. And it's interesting that history too. So it hasn't always been illegal. The crime was created in 1929 by a white nationalist South Carolina senator, Livingston Blease. He was the one who wrote a law making crossing the border in the first count a misdemeanor and the second count a felony. And what has happened because of that, it has created some of these industries that we've already talked about, like this private detention industry, this border industrial complex, which is extremely expensive, which invades and infringes upon the rights and the privacy of immigrants and non-immigrants. And if you just look at how costly it's been, you look at how much harm trying to keep people out of our country has enacted compared to the overall benefit of migration, you see that, actually, our supposed fix of this has inflicted more harm upon ourselves and upon others than just letting it be in the first place.
Yeah, the one thing, the first thing comes up, the fact that within 100 miles of the border, it's basically a constitution-free zone.
Yep.
Somebody from the Border Patrol can just stop your car and say, I want to search your car and whatever, and goodness helps you if you happen to have something else in the car at the time.
Yep.
But it's almost as if, this becomes the constitution-free zone.
I live in that zone.
You live in that zone, and it's, it's like, well, this affects my life too. This is part of, and you can't fight a war on immigrants without fighting a war on, people who live here legally and are just minding their own business.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I live 55 miles from the border, and so there are checkpoints relatively close. You drive down the highway 25 minutes, hit the first checkpoint. Then you go into some of these more back roads, and some of these roads lead to the border because they've always kind of led there. And the Border Patrol's installed over the last 20 years, I think there's 150 or so what they call roving checkpoints. They're not always manned, but they often are. And for years, there's like a decade plus where they were never not manned. And to leave to go to the grocery store, U.S. citizens would have to go through a checkpoint. To go to the next town over to visit some neighbors, they would have to go through a checkpoint. This is something that I think a lot of people forget. That is just the daily life for people who live along the border. And this is something that is easy to see. Oh, wow, that doesn't sound cool. But that's actually the case with the border itself. That is just like the border. Like the checkpoints are like a microcosm of the border itself. So when the border was first drawn along the U.S.-Mexico division, a lot of communities that were tightly knit, that were sister cities, that were, essentially one single city or one single community, all of a sudden were cleaved in two. And people, to go to school, to go to their job, to visit their cousin, their mom, whatever, had to all of a sudden go through an international port of entry. And it's just like, what? Like in Nogales, which is the closest border city to us,
Yes.
is 50 miles south of us. The people were so incensed in the 1920s when Border Patrol is 100 years old as of like a month and a half ago. When Border Patrol started patrolling there, they said, look, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We will actually cede this this city to Mexico, as long as you just keep your checkpoints and keep your patrolling north of the border. We don't want to deal with it. Of course, that didn't happen, but they were so upset by the fact that they were going to be monitored. They couldn't seamlessly just like go about their life like they wanted to. They were going to be like, fine, have it. We don't even want to be part of this.
Yeah, I can imagine you had these communities. I mean, for example, what would happen, for example, if you suddenly decided to do this with, Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia, or, some other, we do have cities in America that cross state lines. It's,
Yeah.
I can imagine what that happens, if you just decided to divide these things up. It's very, very much that way, and it's funny too, I often wonder, some of the people screaming, it's probably, it often seems like people who live further away from the border who are screaming loudest about immigrants.
Yeah.
The people aren't going to have to, the people in, maybe in Kentucky who aren't going to have to put up with this, because Kentucky isn't anywhere near the international border. Or, maybe I shouldn't pick on Kentucky, but, maybe it's near Arkansas. But, they're not going to have to put up with this crap, but they want to tell other people how to live it. It seems like, the people who live at the border, you have a case of people who don't live near the border wanting to tell people who live near the border how to live.
Yep. Yeah, there was a good clip. I can't remember exactly where it's from, but it went, semi-viral like 6 months or so ago, about a reporter just, it was before a long line of people getting to the Trump rally, and the reporter was going somewhere, maybe the South. The reporter was saying, how has immigration affected you personally? And just no one saw any effects of immigration personally. Though maybe unbeknownst to them, or if they hadn't really thought about it, it's like, actually, probably like the salad you had for lunch that day was, the leaves were picked by an immigrant. Probably the inflation is less bad than it would be if we didn't have migrants. There's a lot of economists that said that inflation would be far worse right now if there weren't a lot of people who came to the United States and post 2020. So yeah, the negative effects are minor or absent, and the positive effects are maybe invisible but very present.
Yeah, and of course we haven't even talked to you about how, no matter where I go, I've learned that immigrants from anywhere to anywhere, they love to open restaurants.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It's just like when I saw these Korean restaurants in Mongolia, it says, well, that's all they get out of North Korea. China doesn't treat them well, so they go to Mongolia and they get treated pretty well in Mongolia. So you can find all these Korean restaurants in Mongolia.
Well,
yeah, it's almost where you certainly see that, and it's like, isn't it just that's truly one thing that does promote goodwill, is just making good food. It's just,
totally. Yeah, I mean, think about what American cuisine is like. Little Italy's in many cities throughout the country. It's like, this is something we celebrate, we love, and just how much like Tex-Mex or whatever, just like it's all so like dependent on and like inspirited by and spiced up by like immigration, and we love it, except when it comes to like election year or talking point or needing to paint a target on someone's back. I mean, the hypocrisies are many, and they run very wide.
And some of these good restaurants aren't necessarily in the good neighborhoods, but and definitely, John, if you come here, the Mexican, go 75 miles down the road. The Mexican food in San Antonio is so much better than the Mexican food in Austin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good to know. Yeah.
Yeah. No. There's a couple places in Austin, but generally I just say go to San Antonio to get your Mexican food. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take that tip. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one place I like here is Amaya's Taco Village, but
Mm.
I do, and also I do wonder though. You also have other things, where we have these situations too, where it's even people who want to come in for simple things. I had a years ago, I met a guy in Peru, and he was from New York State, but then later he posted on Facebook about how his father died back in the state of New York, and he of course wanted to go to the funeral and bring his Peruvian girlfriend to the funeral. It's like, oh,
Mm.
sorry, you can't come.
Yeah.
And all he wanted, apparently she just applied for a 2-week visa. And it's like to go to a funeral. It's like, why is this being denied?
Yeah, there are stories like that. I mean, they abound, and there's so many cases. I like, yeah, that sounds tragic, and I hope the guy was able to make his dad's funeral. But
Well,
things.
yeah, he was able to because he was still American, but he wanted to have his Peruvian girlfriend with him. It's
Yeah, I mean, similar situations happen all the time, and a family member who dies or is dying, and they are worried about not being able to get permission to go and either cross back into the country they came
yeah,
from, or come into the United States if their family members here. Another situation that we're seeing right now is just the basic denial of protection, and in the upholding of both U.S. and international law for asylum and refugee protocols. I was with a family a couple weeks ago in northern Mexico who had triplets, and they were 10-month-old triplets, and they had a 2-year-old daughter. And they were hounded by a cartel in the state of Guerrero in southern Mexico or central Mexico. And
Guerrero is where Acapulco is. It's on the coast.
that's right. And
I've actually been there several times, even though it's considered one of the more dangerous
yeah,
states.
it has been beset by violence for a decade. It's extremely dangerous. And this guy is 22 years old, the father of 4. He was threatened to be recruited, and if they didn't recruit him, they said they would chop off his head and kill his 3 young children. So he had one slightly older one, and he came terrified, trying to find asylum in the United States with his whole family, and they denied him. This first day, they deported him, and they deported the 3 triplets back to Mexico, and gave the whole family a 5-year ban. And he's right now in northern Mexico, languishing, has no idea what to do, where to go. He swears he cannot go back to Guerrero. It's too dangerous. He doesn't want he or his family to be killed. And like the United States just callously pushes him right back across the border. And the stories you can go and just start hearing are just absolutely tragic. And it is just the daily reality of this border enforcement regime. It's really a shame.
I know one person. I can't remember the exact details, and he's actually an American, but he was in the process of crossing the border, and for whatever reason, they ended up having to leave the dog in the car for like 3 hours. And Texas summer, you can imagine what happened here. He was so upset about that.
Yeah. This is the thing that doesn't get talked about very much. I've been kind of scouting to try to do an article on this, but family separations, I've covered a lot. Obviously, people know about them, but pet separations is a thing that happens too. When people migrate, either legally or are trying to find asylum, often their pets aren't allowed in. Or the process is too arduous and they can't meet all the requirements, and end up losing their pets, which for a lot of people that is also a tragedy. I mean, these are your life companions and emotional support animals, whether or not officially.
Yeah.
And it's a really sad situation for a lot of people.
Yeah, and this wasn't a case of emotionally support, but as you can imagine, hot summer, 3 hours, dog in the car for 3 hours. Yeah, actually it ended up. I think it ended up being like a case. They ended up actually. It didn't end up killing the dog, but the dog got into the situation where they ended up putting it's out of its misery anyway. But it was I would think pets. I never thought about pets, but pets obviously, animals are crossing the border all the time. Nobody's monitoring them.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way you can. Yeah, that's something too. Though there is a case, sometimes where they really are putting a lot of controls on pets for whatever reason. Sometimes I think it's just sick. It's almost like you do it just to make yourself feel better.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's actually effective, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, yeah, I mean, stray dogs are pretty prevalent along the border, and they slip through the bars, no problem. I mean, some of them are too big, but most of them are not. They're, skinny, skin and bones, little street dog, and they're
And
bad.
certainly snakes and mice and rats and
Yep.
mosquitoes and
All the rest, yeah.
and bees, and it's a.
Yep.
I don't, that's one area where I don't know necessarily if I am a totally open borders guy. I mean, Pablo Escobar, brought a bunch of hippopotamuses into Colombia. And it's like,
Oh,
why are
yeah.
you bringing hippopotamuses into Colombia? They don't live there.
Yeah.
But
It's a different thing. It's like animal trafficking. A lot of that. Yeah. I mean, just like they're in the wrong environment. You're going to mess up the ecosystem wherever they go. Just don't be an idiot. Yeah.
Yeah. The Colombian government, apparently they actually went out and apparently they found all of them and they sterilized all of them.
Oh,
they didn't kill them, but they said, it's like, these animals don't belong here. They should never have been here in the first place. So but we're not going to kill them, but there aren't going to be any more of them after they all die. So,
it seems like maybe a good move, actually. Yeah. I also agree.
But, Pablo Escobar was very likely the richest drug dealer ever. I mean, he was probably a billionaire. So
yeah.
And some of these people have do these weird things, like bring in some exotic animals for whatever reason. It's. I have to admit, I'm not particularly libertarian about stuff like that.
Yes.
And even, sometimes when I see some of these huskies and other Alaskan Malamutes down here in Texas in the summer, it's just like, why is that poor dog here?
I know, you just feel bad for it. Yeah, totally.
But, it's, but obviously, maybe somebody moved from Alaska, and that's the dogs. Dogs are family. They really are. But
yeah.
It's and also I've even heard I can't only one story, only one source, but I even once heard a story of a bone marrow donor being denied entry.
Yeah, I mean, the you could pick up so many crazy stories like that. I mean, people, there's a recent report about medical deportations, where people who were in the country and didn't have, undocumented, and got hurt, and the hospitals decided to take it upon themselves to try to deport them because it would be supposedly less costly to actually pay for like a med flight, which is incredibly expensive, than to continue care. Just like, really, I mean, you could just kind of start digging in any direction and you'll find some of these just absolutely cases.
Well, I was just thinking, what about the rights of the person who needed that bone marrow donation? It's, you can't, just somebody coming in. I mean, you hear, and I heard another story, about, somebody getting involved with scammy attorneys. A lady was trying to bring her fiance from Jamaica, and I do think in some cases you get that case where people are maybe using the system or using marriage to get into the system.
Sure. Yeah.
And they'll deny these visas on the grounds that, well, you'll overstay your visa, because from what I hear, actually more illegal immigrants are not people who crossed illegally, but people who came in, on a 6-month visa and ended up staying.
That's
5
right.
years.
Yeah. Going back to the ineffectiveness of the wall. Absolutely. Like it doesn't address many of the issues, and it doesn't address another thing that we touched on. It doesn't address drugs too much, because overwhelmingly, like over 90% of the illegal narcotics that are getting to the United States right now are through ports of entry. So building more miles of wall doesn't address that at all.
Yeah, and speaking of drugs, the one lady I know who's lived in, she might be getting up to 8 or 9 years now, lived in Mexico, but she entered Mexico, and I think she's actually been living illegally in Mexico for many years now, but she's there because she has marijuana charges in the U.S. and she's not coming back. And Her partner was actually murdered in Acapulco because they went to Acapulco in this, as we talked about before, the
Yeah.
state of Colorado,
Yeah.
which was quite unfortunate. But just
Yeah.
and
Well,
yeah.
Chris, I
Well,
should
me on, John. Yeah.
get rolling in a moment, but I'm really
Okay.
happy to have this conversation. Thanks for inviting me on.
Where can we find you on the net?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, JB Washing. I write for Arizona Luminaria, and my book is Case for Open Borders, and you can find it, wherever books are sold. Hopefully, your local bookstore, but also Amazon and all the big ones.
Okay, John. Well, thank you very much. Please like my video, subscribe to the channel. Go check out my Substack. Go buy my own novel, Escape from the Village. Thank you, John Washington. Have a good day, and we're out.